December 1st, 1815, arrived with the particular stillness that precedes snowfall, the sky hanging low and grey over the modest Ashworth estate, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Eleanor had known before Dr. Thornhill spoke, had known for months in the way her body betrayed her with each rattling cough, each morning that found her weaker than the last, each evening when she retired earlier than a woman of 26 ought to require. She sat in the cold parlour with her hands folded in her lap, her grey wool dress doing little to ward off the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls, and watched the physician's face as he delivered his verdict. Consumption, he called it, though the word hardly mattered when the meaning was so terribly clear. Perhaps a year, he said, his voice gentle in that practised way physicians adopt when speaking to the dying, though more likely she would see one final Christmas and little beyond. Beside her, Margaret Ashworth collapsed into weeping, the sound raw and animal in the quiet room, and Eleanor found herself reaching out to take her mother's trembling hand even as her own heart seemed to slow and still within her chest. She ought to feel something more, she thought, some great wave of grief or terror, but instead there was only a strange calm settling over her like the frost forming on the windows. She had suspected this for so long that the confirmation felt almost like relief, the end of uncertainty, if not the end of fear. Dr. Thornhill spoke of treatments and tonics, of rest and warmth, but Eleanor heard the hollow notes beneath his words. The admission that medicine could offer little against what ravaged her lungs. When he departed, leaving behind a bottle of laudanum and instructions she would not follow, Eleanor gently extracted herself from her mother's desperate embrace and crossed to the window. The December frost had painted delicate patterns on the glass, crystalline ferns and flowers that would melt with the first touch of warmth, beautiful precisely because they were so temporary. She pressed her fingertips to the cold pane and watched her breath form small clouds that obscured and revealed the grey world beyond. One Christmas, she thought, and the words held a strange poetry. She had always loved this season, the evergreen boughs and candlelight, the way the world grew quiet and still beneath its blanket of white. If she must have only one remaining, let it be Christmas. Behind her, she could hear her mother's sobs subsiding into soft hiccups of grief, could feel the weight of pity and sorrow that would now follow her every movement. She would need to be strong, Eleanor realized, not for herself, but for those who loved her. She would need to smile and reassure, to pretend that acceptance was the same as peace. The frost beneath her fingers began to melt from her warmth, leaving clear streaks through which she could see the winter garden, dormant and waiting for a spring she might never witness. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The winter assembly rooms on the evening of December 5th blazed with candlelight that seemed to mock the darkness Eleanor carried within her heart. Hundreds of tapers reflected in gilt mirrors and crystal chandeliers until the whole space shimmered like something from a fever dream. She had insisted on attending despite her mother's protests and Harriet's worried glances, had donned her finest dress of deep green velvet, and allowed her cousin to arrange her auburn hair with care, because if this was to be her last season of society, then she would meet it with her chin raised and her shoulders straight. Now she sat in a chair along the wall, apart from the dancers who swirled past in their silks and satins, and watched the living world carry on as if her own quiet ending was not approaching with each laboured breath she drew. Lady Harriet had been pulled into a country dance by an eager young officer, and Eleanor had waved away her cousin's hesitation with a smile that cost her more than she would admit. The music rose and fell around her, violins and pianoforte weaving melodies that seemed to belong to another lifetime, and she found herself studying the dancers with the detached interest of an observer rather than a participant. It was then that she first heard the whispers, drifting toward her like poisoned petals on a winter wind. "Look at the Duke of Somerton," one woman murmured to another just behind Eleanor's chair, standing there as if we were all beneath his notice. "They say he has not danced once this season," her companion replied, "and his poor mother despairs of him ever taking a wife." Eleanor's gaze followed their words across the room to where a tall figure stood alone near the refreshment table, his dark evening clothes stark against the warm candlelight, his face arranged in an expression of such studied boredom that it bordered on contempt. Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Somerton, she recognized him from the whispers that had preceded his arrival in the county, a man of immense wealth and rumoured coldness, who had recently inherited his father's title. His dark hair was swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and aristocratic bones, and even from this distance she could see the piercing quality of his blue eyes as they swept dismissively over the assembled company. Eleanor found herself oddly sympathetic to his isolation, understanding in some small way what it meant to stand apart from the warmth and joy of ordinary life. Their eyes met across the crowded room, a brief collision of gazes that lasted perhaps 2 heartbeats before he looked away, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm despite the chill that seemed to live permanently in her bones now. She turned her attention back to the dancers, suppressing a cough that threatened to rise in her throat, and tried not to hear the fresh whispers that had begun behind her. "Poor Miss Ashworth," someone said with that particular tone of false sympathy that society excelled at producing. "She looks positively consumptive this evening. They say Dr. Thornhill has been visiting the house daily," another voice added, "and you know what that means." Eleanor kept her spine straight and her expression serene, even as each word landed like a small, sharp stone against her heart, and reminded herself that their pity would soon be irrelevant, as would everything else in this glittering room full of people who had their whole lives stretching before them like an endless summer she would never see. The hour had grown late when Eleanor felt rather than saw someone approach her quiet corner, and she looked up from her contemplation of the dancers to find the Duke of Somerton standing before her with an expression that suggested he was as surprised by his own presence as she was. "Forgive me," he said, his voice deeper than she had expected, and carrying none of the coldness the gossips had attributed to him. "But I noticed you have been watching the room with rather more intelligence than anyone else here this evening. And I confess I grew curious about what you see." Eleanor felt her lips curve into a smile, despite herself, the first genuine expression she had worn all evening. "I see a great deal of effort expended in the pursuit of appearing effortless," she replied, "and a considerable amount of energy devoted to conversations that contain no substance whatsoever." He surprised her then by laughing, a short sound that seemed to escape him against his will, and he gestured to the empty chair beside her, with a questioning raise of his dark brow. "May I?" She nodded, and he settled into the seat with a grace that belied his imposing frame, and for a moment they simply watched the dancers together in companionable silence. "You are Miss Ashworth, are you not?" he said finally, and when she confirmed her identity he nodded as if filing the information away. "I understand you are a great reader." Harriet must have mentioned it, Eleanor thought, though she could not imagine when her cousin might have spoken to the Duke. "I find books to be more honest companions than most people," she admitted, and the words came more easily than she had expected, perhaps because she no longer felt the need to impress anyone with her remaining time so short. "What do you read, Miss Ashworth?" he asked, and something in his tone suggested genuine interest rather than polite inquiry. "Poetry mostly," she said, Keats in particular. I find something comforting in his understanding that beauty and mortality are intertwined, that a thing need not last forever to matter. She had not meant to speak so revealingly, but the late hour and her own weariness had loosened her tongue, and she saw something shift in his blue eyes, some deepening of attention that made her feel truly seen for the first time in months. "We are all of us moving toward ending," she continued softly, "and there is grace in acknowledging that truth rather than hiding from it." The Duke was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice had lost its sardonic edge entirely. "That is a remarkably honest philosophy for a ballroom, Miss Ashworth." She felt a cough building in her chest and pressed her hand to her throat as if to hold it back, watching his gaze track the movement with an attention she did not understand. "I fear I must retire early," she said, rising carefully and feeling the exhaustion that had been building all evening settle into her bones like lead. "But I have enjoyed our conversation, Your Grace, more than I expected to enjoy anything this evening." She felt his eyes follow her as Harriet appeared at her elbow to guide her toward the door, and she carried the warmth of genuine connection with her into the cold December night. The morning of December 8th found Frederick Ravenscroft standing at the tall windows of his London townhouse, watching sleet trace silver patterns down the glass, while his mind wandered far from the grey streets below to a quiet corner of a country assembly room where a woman in green velvet had spoken of mortality with the calm acceptance of a philosopher and the grace of someone who had already made peace with truths most people spent their lives avoiding. He had not slept well in the 3 nights since the assembly, his thoughts returning again and again to the shadows beneath her grey eyes, to the way she had pressed her hand to her throat as if holding back something that threatened to escape, to the honest beauty of her words about fleeting things mattering despite their impermanence. Behind him, Lord George Hastings lounged in a leather chair by the fire, watching his friend with the particular attention of someone who had known Frederick since their school days and could read his moods like a familiar book. "You have been distracted since we returned from the country," George observed, swirling brandy in his glass despite the early hour, "and I suspect it has something to do with the young woman you spent half the evening talking to while ignoring every eligible heiress in the room." Frederick turned from the window, his expression carefully controlled in the way that George knew meant he was feeling something he did not wish to acknowledge. "Miss Ashworth," he said, as if the name itself required examination, and George nodded with a knowing smile. "I have made inquiries," Frederick continued, moving to his desk where several letters lay open, their contents already committed to his sharp memory. "She is the daughter of a country gentleman of modest means, her father deceased these 5 years, and she lives with her mother and cousin in circumstances that could charitably be called genteel poverty." George raised an eyebrow at this admission of investigation, but said nothing, sensing there was more to come. "She is also," Frederick said, and something shifted in his voice, some crack in the carefully maintained facade of disinterest, believed to be dying. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and George set down his glass with uncharacteristic gravity. "Frederick," he said slowly, "you cannot mean to involve yourself with a woman who has no future." But Frederick was already thinking of the hospital he funded in secret, of Dr. Alexander Sinclair and his progressive methods that had saved patients other physicians had abandoned, of the way Miss Ashworth had smiled when she spoke of Keats as if poetry could illuminate even the darkest truths. "Country physicians are not infallible," Frederick said, his jaw set with the determination that George recognized from 100 battles large and small throughout their friendship, "and I would know the truth of her condition before I accept their verdict." George opened his mouth to argue. to remind Frederick of duty and propriety and the dangers of attachment, but something in his friend's blue eyes stopped him cold. "Have my carriage prepared," Frederick told his waiting footman, "and send word to Dr. Sinclair that I require his consultation on a matter of some urgency." Through the window, the sleet had turned to snow, and somewhere in the countryside, a woman he had spoken to only once sat contemplating what she believed would be her final Christmas, unaware that a man she barely knew had already resolved to prove her wrong. The sound of carriage wheels on frozen gravel brought Eleanor to the window of the small parlour on the afternoon of December the 10th, and she watched with growing astonishment as a fine vehicle bearing an unmistakable crest came to a stop before the modest Ashworth home, its polished black surfaces gleaming even in the weak winter sunlight that filtered through the grey clouds above. She had scarcely time to smooth her hair and adjust the worn shawl around her shoulders before the maid announced the Duke of Somerton, and then he was there in their cramped parlour, his tall frame and immaculate dark coat making the faded wallpaper and threadbare carpet seem shabbier than ever before. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, rising from her chair and feeling a flush of embarrassment at the cold that permeated the room despite the small fire struggling in the grate. "This is an unexpected honour." Frederick bowed with perfect formality, but his blue eyes moved quickly around the room, taking in details she wished he would not see. The patches on the curtains, the empty coal scuttle, the way she clutched her thin shawl against the chill that no amount of dignity could disguise. "I came to return this," he said, producing a small volume of poetry that Eleanor recognized as belonging to Harriet. "Your cousin left it at the assembly, and I thought to deliver it personally as I was passing through the area. It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it, but Eleanor found herself grateful for the pretense that allowed her to invite him to sit, to call for tea that she knew would be weak and served in their second-best cups because the first best had been sold months ago." Her mother appeared almost immediately, fluttering with nervous excitement at having a duke in their parlour, and Eleanor watched Frederick respond to Margaret Ashworth with a gentleness that surprised her. Answering her anxious questions about his journey with patience that belied his reputation for coldness. "You are not well, Miss Ashworth," Frederick said when her mother had excused herself to see about refreshments, and Eleanor felt the truth of his observation in the cough she could not quite suppress, in the weakness that made even the short walk from window to chair feel like a journey of miles. "I am well enough," she replied, lifting her chin with the stubborn pride that had carried her through every difficulty since her father's death, "and I thank you for your concern." He leaned forward then, his expression intent in a way that made her heart beat faster, despite her determination to remain unmoved. "I would like to extend an invitation," he said, "for you and your family to spend Christmas at Somerton Hall. My estate is warm, well supplied, and I have access to physicians whose methods are more advanced than those typically found in country practice." Eleanor felt hope and suspicion war within her chest, and suspicion won because it was safer, because hoping hurt too much when disappointment was inevitable. "I appreciate your kindness, Your Grace," she said carefully, "but I fear my health does not permit such an undertaking, and I would not wish to be a burden upon your hospitality." She saw something flicker in his eyes, frustration perhaps or determination, but he only nodded and rose to take his leave, pausing at the door to look back at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I shall call again, Miss Ashworth," he said, and it sounded less like a social pleasantry than a promise, if you will permit me. She nodded because she could not think of a reason to refuse, and long after his carriage had disappeared down the lane, she sat in the cold parlour wondering why a duke would trouble himself with a dying woman of no consequence, and why his attention made her feel, for the first time in weeks, as if she might still matter to someone beyond these walls. The evening of December the 12th brought heavy snow that fell past the windows of the Ashworth parlour like a curtain being drawn between their modest home and the rest of the world, and Eleanor sat wrapped in her shawl, watching the white accumulation with the peculiar peace of someone who had accepted that beauty could exist alongside endings when the sound of wheels on snow announced an arrival she had not expected but had perhaps secretly hoped for in the quiet chambers of her heart. Frederick Ravenscroft entered their parlour for the second time in 3 days, snowflakes melting in his dark hair and his blue eyes finding hers immediately with an intensity that made her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with the illness slowly claiming her lungs. He had brought gifts this time, a basket of hothouse oranges and a package of fine tea that her mother received with trembling gratitude and tears she tried to hide. And Eleanor watched him accept Margaret Ashworth's effusive thanks with a gentleness that continued to surprise her, given everything she had heard of his coldness. When they were seated, and her mother had excused herself to see about refreshments that Eleanor knew they could barely afford to provide, Frederick leaned forward with the air of a man who had prepared his arguments carefully and would not be easily dismissed. "I have thought much about our conversation, Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice low and earnest in the candle-lit room, "and I confess I cannot accept your refusal without making my case more thoroughly." Eleanor felt her defences rise, even as something warmer stirred beneath them, and she clutched her shawl tighter, as if it could protect her from hope, which had become more dangerous to her than any illness. "You speak of Somerton Hall as if it were merely a house," he continued, "but I wish you to understand what awaits there. A library of 1,000 volumes, including first editions I believe would bring you joy, conservatories where flowers bloom even in deepest winter, and warmth, Miss Ashworth, warmth in every room from fires that never go out." She opened her mouth to protest, but he pressed on with determination. "Dr. Alexander Sinclair is the finest physician I know, and his methods have saved patients that others had abandoned, and he has already agreed to attend you at Somerton if you will only come." Eleanor met his eyes then, searching for the pity she dreaded, and finding instead something that looked almost like desperation, like a man fighting for something he could not bear to lose. "Why?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why does it matter to you what becomes of me?" The snow fell heavier outside, muffling the world, and Frederick was silent for a long moment before he answered. "Because I have attended 100 assemblies and spoken with 100 women who wanted only my title," he said slowly. "And in one conversation with you, I found more genuine connection than in all those encounters combined, and I am not prepared to let that disappear without a fight." Harriet appeared in the doorway, her expression softer than it had been during his first visit, and Eleanor felt the weight of 3 people waiting for her answer, while the snow continued falling like time itself made visible. "I will consider it," she said finally, and the relief that transformed Frederick's features told her that she had already made her decision, even if she was not yet ready to speak it aloud. The morning of December the 15th dawned grey and bitterly cold, but inside Frederick's finest carriage, Eleanor found herself cocooned in warmth such as she had not experienced in months. Surrounded by thick woolen blankets and warmed by copper bricks wrapped in flannel that had been heated and placed at her feet with such careful attention that she felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness of being cared for. Her mother sat beside her, alternating between anxious glances at Eleanor's pale face and wonder at the velvet upholstery and polished brass fittings of a vehicle finer than anything they had ridden in since her father's death, while Harriet watched the snowy landscape pass with an expression that suggested she was reserving judgment on this entire endeavour until she saw how it would unfold. Eleanor pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass of the window and watched the familiar countryside of her home give way to roads she had never traveled, each mile carrying her further from everything she knew and closer to what she had privately accepted would be the place where she would spend her final days upon this earth. Frederick rode alongside the carriage on a magnificent black horse, and though propriety kept him from travelling inside with them, Eleanor found her eyes drawn to his figure again and again through the frosted window, noting how he checked on their progress, how he signalled the driver to slow when the road grew rough and her cough worsened with the jostling. At midday they stopped at a coaching inn where Frederick had arranged a private parlour with a roaring fire, and he helped Eleanor from the carriage himself, his strong hands steady at her waist as she descended on legs weakened by hours of travel and the relentless drain of her illness. "Are you well enough to continue?" he asked quietly, his blue eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her heart flutter despite her exhaustion. And she nodded because she could not bear to delay, because some part of her feared that if she stopped moving forward, she might never find the courage to continue. The final hours of the journey passed in a haze of weariness, and Eleanor must have dozed, because she woke to Harriet gently shaking her shoulder and the sound of her mother gasping. And when she raised her heavy eyes to the window, she understood why. Somerton Hall rose before them like something from a dream, its ancient stone walls softened by a blanket of fresh snow that covered every turret and tower in pristine white, its windows glowing with warm candlelight that promised refuge from the bitter cold outside. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest as she gazed upon it, something that was not hope exactly, but rather acceptance of a different kind, an understanding that if she must die, she could not imagine a more beautiful place to do so, and that whatever Frederick's motives might be, she was grateful beyond words that her final Christmas would be spent surrounded by such beauty rather than in the cold, cramped rooms of her family home. The great doors opened as the carriage approached, and servants in crisp livery emerged to help them inside, and Eleanor leaned on Harriet's arm as she climbed the stone steps, thinking that she was entering either her sanctuary or her tomb, and finding that she no longer feared either possibility. The morning of December the 16th found Eleanor propped against fine linen pillows in a chamber more beautiful than any she had ever occupied, watching pale winter light filter through frost-traced windows, while she waited for the physician who would confirm what she already knew, that her lungs were failing, and no amount of warmth or luxury could change the verdict that had been pronounced in her own cold parlour 15 days before. Dr. Alexander Sinclair was not what she had expected, for where Dr. Thornhill had been grave and apologetic with his pronouncement of her doom, this man entered her chamber with keen, intelligent eyes and an air of curiosity rather than resignation, as if her illness were a puzzle to be solved rather than a sentence to be accepted. Harriet sat in the corner as propriety demanded, her needlework forgotten in her lap as she watched the physician listen to Eleanor's breathing through a curious wooden instrument he called a stethoscope. And Eleanor found herself noting how his questions differed from those she had answered before, inquiring not just about her cough and her weakness, but about her diet, her home, the temperature of the rooms where she had spent her days, the quality of the air she breathed. "Tell me about your winters, Miss Ashworth," he said, his Scottish accent lending warmth to the clinical inquiry. And Eleanor described the cold that seeped through the walls of the Ashworth house, the damp that never quite left the parlour, the fires they could not afford to keep burning through the night. Dr. Sinclair nodded slowly, and something in his expression made Eleanor's heart quicken despite her determination to expect nothing, for she saw not the sorrowful certainty of a man delivering a death sentence, but rather the thoughtful consideration of one who was not yet prepared to surrender. "I will not tell you that you are well, Miss Ashworth," he said finally, sitting back in his chair and regarding her with directness. "She found refreshing after weeks of pitying glances, for your lungs have been weakened and you require careful attention." But I will tell you that I have seen patients in far worse condition recover when given warmth, rest, proper nourishment, and time away from the conditions that caused their decline. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes even as she struggled against the treacherous bloom of hope in her chest, and she gripped the bed covers with fingers that trembled as Dr. Sinclair outlined a regimen of tonics and rest and gentle walks when she grew stronger, speaking of weeks and months rather than days, of improvement rather than inevitable decline. Outside her door, she learned later from Harriet, Frederick Ravenscroft had paced the corridor like a caged beast, his famous reserve entirely abandoned as he waited for news, and when Dr. Sinclair emerged to deliver his cautiously optimistic assessment, the Duke's relief was so visible, so profound, that even Harriet admitted she could no longer doubt the sincerity of his concern. Eleanor lay in her warm chamber after they had all departed, listening to the fire crackle and watching snowflakes drift past her window, and for the first time since that grey morning in her parlour, she allowed herself to imagine that she might live to see spring, that the Christmas she had thought would be her last might instead be the first of many, and that perhaps, just perhaps, she had been brought to this beautiful place, not to die, but to begin again. The days that followed Dr. Sinclair's examination passed in a gentle rhythm that Eleanor had never known, each morning bringing weak winter sunlight through her chamber windows and the soft sounds of a great house preparing for Christmas, and each afternoon bringing Frederick to her door with another volume tucked beneath his arm, and questions in his eyes that had nothing to do with her health, and everything to do with her thoughts on Milton or Shakespeare or the philosophy of living well in uncertain times. On the first day he found her propped against her pillows, still too weary to rise, and without asking permission, he settled into the chair beside her bed and opened a volume of poetry, reading aloud in his deep voice while Eleanor closed her eyes and let the words wash over her like warm water, feeling something tight in her chest begin to loosen as she listened to verses about beauty and truth and the eternal nature of art. By the second day she was strong enough to sit in the chair by the window, wrapped in the soft blue shawl that had appeared in her room without explanation, but which she suspected bore Frederick's thoughtfulness in every thread, and their conversation turned from poetry to philosophy as they debated whether it was better to live briefly with passion or long with caution. And Eleanor found herself arguing for passion with a vehemence that surprised her, as if some part of her soul was awakening from a long sleep. Frederick listened to her with an intensity that made her feel sun in ways she had never experienced, his blue eyes never leaving her face as she spoke, and when she said something that amused him, his laughter came sudden and warm, transforming his severe features into something almost boyish, and Eleanor discovered that making him laugh had become her secret goal each afternoon. On the third day she felt well enough to take her meals in the small sitting room adjoining her chamber, and Frederick joined her for tea, and somewhere between discussing Wordsworth's views on nature and arguing about whether novels could be as worthy as poetry, Eleanor realized that her cough had eased, that color had returned to her cheeks, that she had not thought about death in hours. The snow continued falling outside, blanketing Somerton Hall in white silence, and through her window Eleanor could see servants hanging evergreen boughs and carrying armfuls of holly, the whole house transforming for the approaching holiday while she transformed within it, growing stronger day by day under the careful attention of Dr. Sinclair's tonics and Frederick's company. Harriet watched these developments with knowing eyes, commenting one evening that Eleanor smiled more in a single afternoon with the Duke than she had in the entire previous year, and Eleanor found she could not deny it, could only press her hand to her warming cheek and wonder at how quickly her resignation to death had been replaced by something that felt dangerously like hope, like hunger for more days exactly like these, filled with books and firelight and the sound of Frederick's voice reading words that seemed to speak directly to her awakening heart. December 20th dawned with pale winter sunlight breaking through the clouds for the first time in days, casting long, golden rays across the snow-covered grounds of Somerton Hall, and Eleanor woke feeling something she had almost forgotten existed within her, a sense of anticipation for the day ahead rather than dread of what it might steal from her fading strength. Frederick arrived at her chamber door precisely at 11 in the morning, and when he asked if she felt well enough for a short walk, she found herself saying yes before caution could intervene. Wrapping the soft blue shawl around her shoulders and placing her hand on his offered arm with a naturalness that would have seemed impossible days ago, when she had sat in her cold parlour listening to Dr. Thornhill pronounce her death sentence. He led her through corridors she had not yet explored, past portraits of Ravenscroft ancestors who watched their passage with painted eyes, until they reached a set of glass doors that opened into what could only be described as a miracle. A vast conservatory filled with blooming flowers despite the frozen world visible through its crystalline walls, the air warm and sweet with the scent of roses and jasmine and green growing things that had no right to exist in December. Eleanor stopped at the threshold, her breath catching in her throat as she beheld the impossible garden before her. Hothouse roses in shades of pink and cream climbing iron trellises, jasmine cascading from hanging baskets, and everywhere the lush verdant promise of life persisting against all expectation. She felt tears slip down her cheeks before she could stop them, and when Frederick asked with concern whether she was unwell, she could only shake her head and whisper that she had never seen anything so beautiful, that she had thought she would never see flowers bloom again, that this felt like standing inside a dream she had been too afraid to allow herself. His hand found hers then, ostensibly to steady her as they walked among the blossoms, but neither of them pretended it was only practicality that kept their fingers intertwined as they moved through the warm, fragrant air. "You see?" he said quietly, his blue eyes intense upon her face. "Nature can be defied when the conditions are right, when someone cares enough to create warmth where there should be cold, life where there should be only dormancy." Eleanor understood that he was not speaking only of flowers, and something cracked open in her chest, some wall she had built between herself and hope, between herself and the future she had been too frightened to imagine. She looked at their joined hands, at his strong fingers wrapped around her pale ones, and she allowed herself for the first time to feel the full weight of what was growing between them, tender and improbable as these winter roses, requiring only warmth and care, and the stubborn refusal to accept that beauty must always surrender to the cold. Christmas Eve morning arrived with the sound of carriage wheels crunching through snow, and Eleanor stood at her chamber window, watching as vehicle after vehicle rolled up the long drive to Somerton Hall, delivering lords and ladies in fine furs and velvet cloaks, their laughter carrying through the cold air as footmen rushed to assist them, and she felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with her illness, and everything to do with the sudden intrusion of the outside world into the quiet sanctuary she and Frederick had built over the past 23 days. She had dressed with particular care that morning, choosing a rose-colored gown that Harriet had insisted brought out the new warmth in her cheeks, and when she examined herself in the mirror, she could scarcely believe she was looking at the same woman who had received her death sentence in that cold parlor less than a month ago. For color had indeed returned to her face, and her grey eyes held a brightness that surprised her. By midday, the great hall was filled with guests, and Eleanor descended the staircase on Harriet's arm to find herself surrounded by curious glances and whispered conversations that fell silent as she passed. And though Frederick caught her eye from across the room with a look of such tender concern that her heart stuttered, she could not reach him through the press of bodies and social obligations that separated them. It was in the withdrawing room that she first heard the whispers clearly. Lady Crawford's sharp voice carrying from behind a potted palm as she remarked to her companions that she simply could not fathom why the Duke would burden himself with an invalid nobody during the Christmas season, that surely there were charity hospitals for such unfortunate cases, and that the poor girl looked as though a strong wind might carry her away despite the suspicious bloom in her cheeks. Eleanor froze where she stood, feeling the fragile hope she had been nurturing shatter like thin ice beneath her feet. And all the old doubts came rushing back. The certainty that Frederick's attention was merely pity dressed in kindness. That she was a fool to imagine a duke could truly want a dying woman of no fortune or consequence. She retreated to a quiet alcove near the window, pressing her hand against the cold glass, and willing herself not to cry, not to cough, not to give these elegant vultures any more ammunition for their cruelty. Harriet found her there moments later, her cousin's face flushed with anger as she declared that Lady Crawford was a bitter old cat whose own daughters had failed to secure husbands for 3 seasons running. But Eleanor could only shake her head and whisper that perhaps the woman was right, that she did not belong in this glittering world, that she should never have allowed herself to forget what she was. Across the room, Frederick watched Eleanor withdraw into herself, saw the light fade from her eyes, and felt a cold fury building in his chest, alongside a desperate certainty that he could wait no longer to speak the words burning inside him. The library at Somerton Hall glowed with the warm amber light of candles and firelight, as Eleanor sat alone in a leather chair near the hearth. The blue shawl Frederick had given her wrapped around her shoulders like armor against the cold that had crept back into her heart, despite the warmth of the room, and she stared into the dancing flames, trying to convince herself that retreating from the gathering had been the right choice, that she did not belong among those glittering guests with their sharp eyes and sharper tongues, that she had been foolish to imagine even for a moment that she could be anything more than an object of charity and curiosity in this grand house. The door opened softly, and she knew without turning that it was Frederick, knew by the weight of his footsteps and the way the air itself seemed to change when he entered a room. And when he spoke her name, his voice held none of its usual careful reserve, but rather a raw urgency that made her pulse quicken despite her determination to expect nothing. He crossed the room to stand before her, and in the firelight his blue eyes burned with an intensity she had never seen, all his aristocratic composure stripped away to reveal something fierce and vulnerable beneath. "Eleanor," he said, "I watched you disappear into yourself this evening, and I cannot bear it. I cannot stand by while you retreat behind walls. I thought we had dismantled together, and I must know what has driven you away from me." She tried to deflect, tried to speak of tiredness and the strain of company, but he knelt before her chair and took her hands in his, and the contact shattered her defenses entirely. "I heard what they said," she whispered. "And they are right. I am an invalid of no consequence, a dying woman you have taken in out of pity, and I cannot continue pretending that your kindness is anything more than the charitable impulse of a good man toward an unfortunate creature." Frederick's jaw tightened and his grip on her hands grew firmer, and when he spoke his voice shook with barely contained emotion. "You think I have spent every waking moment of the past 3 weeks at your side out of pity?" he demanded. "You believe I brought you to my home, engaged the finest physician in England, sat reading poetry by your bedside until you fell asleep, held your hand among the winter roses because I felt sorry for you? Eleanor, I have never pitied you for a single moment since the night we met, when I saw you watching the world with such intelligence and acceptance that I felt my own careful existence crack open. I love your strength and your mind and your spirit. I love the way you find beauty in mortality and meaning in fleeting things. I love that you challenged me and never once tried to impress me with anything but your true self." He drew a breath and his voice softened. "Marry me, Eleanor, not because you are dying, but because you are magnificently alive, and I cannot imagine facing whatever time remains to either of us without you beside me." The tears spilled down her cheeks as she shook her head, her heart breaking even as it soared. "I cannot ask you to bind yourself to grief," she said. "I cannot let you make promises to a woman who may not live to keep hers, and I love you too much to sentence you to mourning." He pressed his forehead to their joined hands, and in the firelight she saw that his eyes were bright with unsaid tears as well. Eleanor did not sleep that Christmas Eve night, lying instead beneath silk coverlets in her warm chamber while the fire burned low and the hours crept toward dawn, her mind returning again and again to Frederick's face in the firelight, to the rawness in his voice when he had declared his love, to the way his forehead had pressed against their joined hands as if in prayer when she had refused him, and she felt as though her heart had been cleaved in two, one half soaring with the knowledge that she was loved, and the other weighted with the certainty that she could not condemn him to watch her die. When the first pale light of Christmas morning began to seep through the frost-laced windows, she rose from her bed and wrapped herself in the blue shawl he had given her, crossing to the window to watch the world emerge from darkness into a landscape transformed by snow, every tree and hedge and rooftop covered in pristine white that glittered faintly in the growing light. And she thought about how she had come to Somerton Hall expecting to die, expecting this to be her final glimpse of winter beauty, her last Christmas among the living. The church bells began to ring in the distance, their sound muffled and sweet through the cold air, and Eleanor pressed her palm against the icy glass and asked herself when exactly she had stopped living and started merely waiting for death, whether it had been the moment Dr. Thornhill delivered his verdict or long before, in the quiet years of watching others dance while she sat apart, of accepting that certain joys were not meant for women like her. She had been given a death sentence and had embraced it almost gratefully, as though it excused her from hoping, from risking, from reaching for happiness that might be snatched away. And even now that Dr. Sinclair had offered her the possibility of life, she clung to her resignation like armor, using her illness as a shield against the terrifying vulnerability of love. A soft knock came at her door, and when Harriet entered, she carried a parcel wrapped in deep green velvet, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope, as she explained that the Duke had left it with instructions that it be delivered at dawn. Eleanor's hands trembled as she unwrapped the gift to reveal a leather-bound volume of poetry, its pages edged in gold and its binding soft with age. A first edition of the very poet they had discussed that night at the assembly when everything between them had begun. She opened the cover and found his handwriting on the fly-leaf, bold and certain despite the intimacy of the words, and she read them through tears that blurred her vision until she had to blink them away to see clearly. "My dearest Eleanor," he had written, "I do not ask you to promise me forever when tomorrow itself is uncertain for any of us. I ask only that you choose to live whatever days remain to either of us with hope rather than fear, with love rather than resignation. For I would rather have one Christmas with you truly present than a lifetime with someone who never made me feel alive. And if you will let me, I will spend every moment proving that hope is worth the risk of heartbreak." The chapel at Somerton Hall had stood for 3 centuries, its ancient stones softened by time, and its tall windows casting jeweled light across the worn flagstones. And on this Christmas morning, it was adorned with garlands of holly and ivy and evergreen boughs that filled the air with the scent of winter forests, candles flickering in every alcove, and along the altar, where the minister stood ready to lead the household and guests in Christmas worship. Eleanor descended the stairs on Harriet's arm, wearing a gown of winter white trimmed with green velvet ribbon that her cousin had pressed upon her that morning with tears in her eyes and a smile on her lips. and she felt the weight of every gaze upon her as she entered the chapel, felt the whispers rise and fall like the flutter of winter birds. But for the first time since arriving at Somerton, she did not shrink from their scrutiny. Frederick stood near the front of the chapel, and when he turned at her entrance, she saw the hope and the fear mingled in his blue eyes, saw how he held himself still and careful, as though afraid any movement might shatter the fragile possibility between them. And she let her gaze meet his fully, and felt something unlock in her chest, a door she had kept barred against hope, finally swinging open to let the light pour through. She walked the length of the chapel on steady legs, stronger than she had been in months, her lungs drawing breath without the rattling cough that had haunted her for so long, and she took her place in the pew beside her mother, directly across the narrow aisle from where Frederick stood with Lord George at his side. The service began, and Eleanor let the familiar words of Christmas worship wash over her, the story of hope born in the darkest season, of light entering a world that had grown accustomed to shadow, and she understood with sudden clarity that she had been living in winter long before her illness, had been waiting for permission to hope that she had never thought to grant herself. When the congregation rose to sing, her voice joined theirs, thin but true, and she felt Frederick's attention like warmth against her skin, even as she kept her eyes fixed on the minister. The hymn spoke of joy and wonder and new beginnings, and Eleanor let the words fill her, let them push out the fear and the resignation, until there was room for nothing but the fierce, bright certainty that she wanted to live, wanted to love, wanted whatever time remained to her, whether it was months or years or decades. As the final verse swelled through the chapel, she felt a touch against her hand where it rested on the pew between them, felt Frederick's fingers brush against hers in a question she answered by turning her palm upward, by letting his hand close around hers in full view of every gossip and guest assembled. She turned her head and met his eyes, and in that gaze she poured everything she could not yet say aloud, her acceptance and her love and her choice to reach for happiness despite the risk, and she watched his face transform with understanding, watched the careful reserve crack open into something radiant and wondering and achingly tender. The service ended, and the congregation began to stir, and Eleanor squeezed his hand once before releasing it, her eyes promising what her lips would soon confirm. The Christmas feast had barely concluded when Frederick found Eleanor in the conservatory, where their connection had first deepened, standing among the hothouse roses with golden afternoon light streaming through the glass and casting warm patterns across her face. And when she turned at the sound of his footsteps, her grey eyes held none of the fear or reservation that had shadowed them the night before, only a quiet certainty that made his breath catch in his throat. She spoke before he could, her voice soft but steady, as she told him that she had spent 25 days believing she was dying, had spent years before that believing she was invisible, had built walls around her heart so thick she had forgotten there was anything worth protecting inside them. And then he had appeared at an assembly and looked at her as though she were worth seeing, had brought her to this place of warmth and beauty and hope, had offered her not pity but partnership, not charity but love. Frederick crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and took her hands in his, feeling how her fingers no longer trembled with weakness but with emotion, and he waited as she continued, her words tumbling out like water finally released from a dam, confessing that she had refused him because she could not bear the thought of him watching her fade, of becoming a burden rather than a blessing, of giving him grief instead of joy, but that his inscription had cracked something open in her chest, had made her understand that love was not about guaranteeing outcomes, but about choosing to hope together, about facing uncertainty hand in hand rather than alone. When she finally fell silent, He lifted her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, then asked her again with all the tenderness and desperation he had shown the night before whether she would consent to be his wife, whether she would let him spend whatever time they were granted, proving that she was worthy of every happiness, whether she would allow him to love her in sickness and in health until death parted them, as it eventually parted everyone. Eleanor's answer came not in words, but in the way she stepped closer, in the way her hands rose to frame his face, in the way she whispered yes against his lips before he kissed her with all the restrained passion of a man who had feared he might never hold her like this. And when they finally drew apart, they were both trembling with joy and relief and the overwhelming awareness that everything had changed. They stood together in the conservatory as the winter sun began its descent, making plans in quiet voices, agreeing that Dr. Sinclair would continue her treatment, that the wedding would take place in spring when she was stronger, that they would face whatever came with honesty and courage. And Eleanor realized that she felt more alive in this moment than she had in years, that choosing hope had not made her vulnerable, but had set her free. Outside the glass walls, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, and Eleanor leaned her head against Frederick's shoulder and watched the flakes drift down, no longer seeing winter as an ending, but as a beginning, as the season when everything she thought impossible had become beautifully, miraculously real. The news spread through Somerton Hall like fire through dry kindling, carried on whispered breaths and knowing glances, as servants moved through corridors and guests gathered in drawing rooms, and by the time the evening meal was served, every person beneath that ancient roof knew that the Duke of Somerton had offered his hand to the pale invalid from the country, and that she had accepted him with tears streaming down her face in the conservatory, where hothouse roses bloomed in defiance of the winter pressing against the glass. Eleanor sat beside Frederick at the long dining table, acutely aware of the eyes upon her, of the calculations being made behind polite smiles, of the disbelief poorly concealed behind congratulations that rang hollow from certain lips. But she found that the weight of their judgment no longer pressed upon her chest as it once had, found that Frederick's hand finding hers beneath the table anchored her to something stronger than their whispered doubts. Lady Crawford's smile was tight as she offered her felicitations, her eyes cataloguing Eleanor's still too thin frame, and the shadows that lingered beneath her grey eyes, clearly expecting this engagement to end in a funeral rather than a wedding. And Eleanor met her gaze with quiet composure and thanked her with genuine graciousness that seemed to unsettle the older woman more than defiance would have done. Margaret Ashworth wept openly at the far end of the table there, tears of joy replacing the tears of grief she had shed so many times since that December morning when Dr. Thornhill had delivered his verdict, and Harriet sat beside her aunt with a smile that transformed her sharp features into something luminous, her earlier suspicions of Frederick's motives long since dissolved by the evidence of his devotion. Lord George raised his glass in a toast that spoke of friendship and unexpected blessings, and the courage to reach for happiness against all odds, and Frederick's answering smile held a warmth that made several guests exchange startled glances, so accustomed were they to the cold and distant Duke they thought they knew. After dinner, Eleanor excused herself early, her strength still limited despite her improvement, and Frederick walked with her to the base of the grand staircase, where propriety demanded they part until the morning, and in that brief moment before she ascended, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles that promised everything words could not properly convey. She climbed the stairs slowly, pausing at the landing to look back and find him still watching her with those piercing blue eyes now softened by tenderness, and she carried that image with her into her chambers where the fire burned warm and the windows showed a world transformed by moonlight on snow. Harriet helped her prepare for bed, chattering happily about wedding plans and spring flowers and the new life that stretched before her cousin like an unwritten book. And Eleanor listened with a smile that felt strange on lips so long accustomed to resignation. When she finally lay alone in the darkness, she pressed her hand against her chest and felt her heart beating steady and strong, felt the breath moving through lungs that no longer rattled with the sound Dr. Thornhill had called fatal, and she whispered a prayer of gratitude into the silence for second chances and winter gardens, and a man who had seen her worth when she had forgotten how to see it herself. The days following Christmas unfolded like pages in a book Eleanor had never dared to read, each morning bringing new evidence that the life she had resigned herself to losing was being returned to her in measures both small and profound, and by the time the calendar turned toward the new year, she found herself walking the corridors of Somerton Hall without assistance, her lungs drawing breath with an ease that would have seemed miraculous mere weeks before when Dr. Thornhill had pronounced his grim verdict in her mother's cold parlour. Frederick remained attentive without being suffocating, seeming to understand instinctively when she needed company and when she needed solitude, appearing at her door each morning with a new volume from his library or a report from Dr. Sinclair about her continued improvement. And Eleanor marveled at how naturally they had fallen into a rhythm together, how the formality of their early acquaintance had softened into something warm and intimate without ever crossing the bounds of propriety. The Christmas guests departed one by one, their carriages cutting dark tracks through the snow that still blanketed the grounds. And Eleanor noted with quiet satisfaction how Lady Crawford's farewell had been stiff with barely concealed resentment, the older woman clearly unable to reconcile herself to the match that society would be discussing for months to come. Margaret Ashworth had transformed from the weeping, anxious mother of those early December days into a woman radiant with hope, fussing over wedding details with an energy that made Harriet laugh and Eleanor smile, and when Eleanor caught her mother gazing at her with tears in her eyes, she understood that Margaret was mourning the grief she had prepared herself to feel, was releasing the funeral she had already planned in her heart. Dr. Sinclair visited every third day to monitor her progress, his examinations growing shorter as there was less to concern him, and he spoke now not of survival, but of full recovery, of years stretching ahead rather than months dwindling behind, of a future that included children and grandchildren, and all the ordinary joys Eleanor had taught herself to stop wanting. Frederick took her to the conservatory nearly every afternoon, walking slowly among the hothouse flowers while she told him about the modest winter garden at the Ashworth home where she had once found solace, and he listened with the same intensity he brought to everything, as though her words were precious things worth preserving in memory. On the final day of December, they stood together at the great windows of the library, watching the last sunset of 1815 paint the snow in shades of rose and gold, and Frederick spoke quietly of his plans for the spring wedding, of the improvements he wanted to make to the dower house for her mother, of the life he imagined them building together in this ancient hall where generations of Ravenscrofts had loved and lost and loved again. Eleanor leaned into his warmth and felt the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder, and understood that she was no longer the woman who had sat alone at a winter assembly preparing to die, that somewhere between December's first grey morning and its final golden evening, she had been reborn into someone capable of believing in tomorrow. And when the clock struck midnight and 1816 arrived, she turned in Frederick's arms and kissed him with all the hope she had finally learned to hold. The winter months that followed were a season of quiet transformation, of days measured not in the shadow of death, but in the gentle accumulation of small joys and returning strength. And Eleanor found herself marking time differently than she had in those dark December days, when every breath had felt borrowed and every sunset had seemed like it might be her last. January brought frozen mornings and crackling fires and long hours in the library, where Frederick read aloud from volumes of poetry, while Eleanor curled beneath blankets with colour returning to her cheeks, and February arrived with its promise of distant spring and the first tentative discussions of wedding dates and guest lists and the life they would build together within these ancient walls. Dr. Sinclair continued his visits, though they grew less frequent as Eleanor's recovery progressed beyond even his optimistic predictions, and each examination brought new assurances that the diagnosis Dr. Thornhill had delivered with such grim certainty had been either wrong from the start or had somehow been reversed by the combination of warmth and rest and nourishment, and something the physician called the healing power of hope. Margaret Ashworth had returned to the modest house in the country, but wrote letters weekly, filled with plans for the wedding and questions about Eleanor's health and barely concealed joy at the fortune that had befallen her daughter, and Harriet remained at Somerton as companion and chaperone, her sharp wit softening into genuine affection for the Duke she had once regarded with such suspicion. Frederick showed Eleanor every corner of Somerton Hall during those winter months, leading her through galleries hung with portraits of Ravenscrofts stretching back centuries, through music rooms where dust covers were removed from instruments that had not been played since his mother's death, through kitchens where cook pressed warm pastries into her hands and declared that the future Duchess needed more flesh on her bones. She learned that he rose before dawn to ride across the frozen grounds, that he spent hours each week corresponding with the physicians at the hospital he funded in London, that he had once dreamed of studying medicine himself before his father's death had thrust the ducal responsibilities upon him. And with each revelation, she fell more deeply in love with the man behind the cold reputation society had assigned him. The banns were read in the village church on 3 consecutive Sundays in February, and Eleanor sat in the family pew beside Frederick and listened to her name spoken aloud in conjunction with his and felt the last remnants of her disbelief dissolving like morning frost beneath the sun. She was going to live, she realized with fresh wonder each morning when she woke without the rattling cough that had haunted her for so long, and she was going to marry a man who had seen her worth when she had been preparing to die, who had refused to accept the verdict that would have stolen her from the world, and who looked at her now not with the pity she had feared, but with a love so evident that even Lady Crawford's sharp tongue had been silenced by its undeniable presence. The wedding morning dawned soft and golden, March light spilling through the windows of Eleanor's chambers at Somerton Hall with a warmth that seemed to promise the spring that had finally arrived after those long winter months of waiting and healing and learning to believe in a future she had once been certain would never come. Eleanor stood before the tall mirror while Harriet fastened the row of pearl buttons that traced the length of her spine, the ivory silk of her gown catching the light and gleaming like morning frost. And she studied her own reflection with something approaching wonder, because the woman who gazed back at her bore so little resemblance to the pale ghost who had sat in her mother's cold parlour on that grey December morning, listening to Dr. Thornhill pronounce what had seemed like a death sentence. Her cheeks held colour now, a healthy rose that owed nothing to cosmetics and everything to the months of rest and warmth and nourishment and love that had transformed her from an invalid resigned to death into a bride trembling with joy on the threshold of a life she had never dared to imagine. Margaret Ashworth wept openly as she adjusted the delicate lace veil that had belonged to Frederick's mother, tears of happiness replacing the tears of grief she had shed so many times during those dark December days, and Harriet's sharp wit had softened into genuine emotion as she pressed Eleanor's hands and declared that she had never seen a more beautiful bride in all her years of attending weddings. The chapel at Somerton had been transformed with spring flowers, hothouse blooms and early daffodils and trailing ivy that spoke of new beginnings and the triumph of life over the cold grip of winter. And Eleanor walked the ancient stone aisle on the arm of Lord George Hastings, who had offered to stand in for the father she had lost years ago, and whose eyes held genuine affection for the woman who had captured his closest friend's heart. Frederick waited at the altar in his finest coat of deep blue, his dark hair touched by the coloured light streaming through the stained glass windows, and when Eleanor met his piercing blue eyes, she saw in them the same overwhelming emotion that threatened to steal her breath and her composure, a love so fierce and so tender that it seemed impossible such feeling could exist in one human heart. The vicar's words washed over her like music as she stood beside the man who had seen her worth when she had been invisible, who had refused to accept the verdict that would have stolen her from the world, who had fought for her life when she had been prepared to surrender it. And when Frederick spoke his vows, his voice carried the tremor of a man who understood exactly how precious the gift of this moment truly was. She spoke her own vows with a clarity and strength that would have been impossible 3 months earlier, her lungs drawing breath without pain, her voice steady with conviction. And when Frederick slipped the gold band onto her finger and bent to kiss his bride, the chapel erupted in applause from guests who had witnessed what even the most cynical among them could only call a miracle of medicine and love and stubborn hope that had refused to die. The years that followed their wedding unfolded like pages in a book Eleanor had once believed she would never live to read, each chapter bringing new joys and challenges that she met with the strength she had discovered within herself during those transformative winter months at Somerton Hall. The first year of their marriage saw Eleanor's health continue to improve until Dr. Sinclair declared her recovery complete, attributing her restoration to the combination of proper care and what he called the remarkable resilience of a spirit that had chosen to live, and Frederick celebrated this pronouncement by commissioning a portrait of his Duchess to hang in the gallery alongside generations of Ravenscrofts who had come before her. Their first child arrived in the spring of 1817, a daughter with her mother's auburn hair and her father's piercing blue eyes, whom they named Charlotte after Frederick's mother, and Eleanor held her newborn in the very chambers where she had once lain, convinced she was dying, and wept with gratitude for the life she had been given against all expectation. A son followed 2 years later, then another daughter, and Somerton Hall filled with the sounds of children's laughter and running feet that echoed through corridors which had known too much silence in the years before Eleanor had arrived to transform them with her quiet warmth and unexpected strength. Frederick continued his work with the hospital in London, eventually establishing a second institution closer to Somerton, where Dr. Sinclair trained young physicians in his progressive methods, and Eleanor became his partner in this endeavor, using her position as Duchess to advocate for those whose illnesses might otherwise have been dismissed as untreatable by less innovative practitioners. Harriet married Lord George Hastings in a ceremony that surprised no one who had observed their spirited arguments, evolving into something tenderer over the course of Eleanor's first winter at Somerton, and Margaret Ashworth lived to see all her grandchildren born, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72 in the warm chambers Frederick had provided for her at the Hall. The gossips who had once whispered about the Duke's peculiar choice of bride eventually fell silent, replaced by a new generation who knew only that the Duke and Duchess of Somerton were devoted to each other and to the causes they championed together, and Lady Crawford herself admitted before her death that she had perhaps been hasty in her judgment of a match that had proved more enduring than any society marriage she had ever witnessed. And on cold December evenings, when snow fell soft and silent over the grounds of Somerton Hall, and candlelight flickered in windows that glowed with warmth against the darkness, Eleanor would sit beside Frederick in the library where he had first declared his love and remember the woman she had been on that grey morning when Dr. Thornhill had told her she had only one Christmas left to live, and she would marvel at the miracle of every breath she had drawn since that moment, every sunrise she had witnessed, every child she had borne, every kiss she had shared with the man who had refused to let her go gently into that long December night, choosing instead to fight for a future that had seemed impossible and making it gloriously, abundantly, wonderfully real.